My stepsister insisted that I leave her dad's company during my stepfather's burial, but when the will was opened, everybody was at shock. I never thought I'd be here, sitting in my apartment surrounded by stacks of old company files and photos, getting ready for Robert's funeral. Robert, my stepfather, the man who somehow managed to be both a rock and a thorn in my side for most of my life. It's weird how death makes you look back on everything. Like, every moment you thought didn't matter suddenly has meaning. It's been a whirlwind, honestly. One second I'm filing reports for R&L Enterprises, making sure everything's running smoothly. The next I'm digging through old photos and trying to figure out what to say at his service. I don't even know how I'm supposed to feel about all this. I mean, do you just forget all the crap because the guy's gone? Or do you carry that weight forever? I guess I should start from the beginning. I was 9 when my mom, Anna, married Robert. It was a small, simple wedding. Nothing fancy. I remember her looking beautiful in this basic white dress. She was so hopeful, like this was her fresh start. Robert, on the other hand, looked like he was walking into a business meeting. Black suit, straight face, barely cracked a smile. I should have known right then what kind of guy he was. Robert wasn't your typical stepdad. No warm hugs or, "I'm so glad to have you in my life" speeches. Nah, he was all about structure and discipline. I could never figure out if he just didn't know how to deal with a kid that wasn't his, or if he really just didn't care. He was always watching, always judging. I remember the way his eyes would narrow at me like I was constantly doing something wrong, even when I wasn't doing anything at all. Growing up with him wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Every little thing I did seemed to irritate him. My grades? Not good enough. How I dressed? Needed improvement. Even the way I held my fork at dinner was a problem. "You need to work harder, Lena," he'd say. "The world isn't kind to slackers." And yeah, I get it now. He thought he was preparing me for the harsh realities of life, but back then, it just felt like he was being mean. Our family vacations were anything but relaxing. Robert planned everything down to the minute. We once got to a museum 15 minutes late, and he was pissed for the rest of the day. No joke. It was like we had committed some kind of crime. He couldn't handle things not going exactly as planned. I hated those trips. They weren't about having fun or making memories. They were just another way for Robert to show us how things should be done properly. When Sophie was born, everything changed. I remember standing outside the hospital room, peeking in through the glass. My mom looked exhausted but happy, cradling this tiny little baby. And Robert? He had this huge grin on his face, the kind I'd never seen before. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Suddenly, he was this proud, doting father. For a 9-year-old, that moment stuck. I thought, oh, maybe this is it. Maybe things will get better. But instead, it was like Sophie's arrival just highlighted all the ways I was falling short. She was perfect in his eyes. And well, I wasn't. From the beginning, Sophie could do no wrong. She'd cry, and Robert would rush to her side, cooing and comforting her. Meanwhile, I'd sit there watching, wondering why he never had that kind of patience for me. When I was upset, it was always, "Lena, stop whining," or "get over it." But with Sophie, everything was different. As she got older, the favoritism became more obvious. Sophie's achievements, no matter how small, were celebrated like she'd just won an Olympic medal. She'd scribble a drawing, and Robert would stick it on the fridge like it was a masterpiece. I remember bringing home a report card with straight A's once, and all I got was a nod and a quick, "keep it up." No fridge space for my accomplishments. It's not that I hated Sophie. She was just a kid, after all. But it was hard not to resent her when every part of our life revolved around her. Birthday parties were a prime example. I still remember my 10th birthday. Robert gave me a card and a small cake. We had dinner at home, just the three of us. Nothing special. But for Sophie's 5th birthday, he rented out an entire play center. There were balloons, games, a magician, and every kid from her class was there. I remember sitting in the corner watching her blow out the candles, feeling invisible. And it wasn't just birthdays. Even day-to-day life was different. Sophie would mess up, spill her milk, or forget to do her homework, and Robert would just laugh it off. "She's learning," he'd say. But if I slipped up, it was like the end of the world. I'd get lectures about responsibility, about how I needed to set a better example. It was like being held to a standard I could never meet. The thing that stung the most was how blind my mom seemed to it all. Whenever I tried to talk to her, she'd brush it off. "Robert loves you, Lena. He's just tough on you because he wants you to be strong." That was her go-to line. And maybe she believed it, but it didn't make it hurt any less. School became my escape. I threw myself into my studies, partly because I wanted to prove I was worth something, and partly because it was the only place I felt like I had control. I wasn't the smartest kid, but I worked hard. I figured if I couldn't win Robert's approval at home, Maybe I could at least make him proud with my grades. But even that didn't seem to matter. No matter how well I did, it was never enough. Good job, he'd say, but you could do even better. That was the theme of our relationship. Not good enough. I could have been the president of the world, and he probably would have found something to critique. What made it worse was seeing how easy Sophie had it. She'd get a B on a test, and Robert would act like she'd just discovered the cure for cancer. It wasn't just frustrating, it was soul-crushing. I started to wonder if I was the problem. Maybe I just wasn't as lovable. Maybe I wasn't the kind of daughter he wanted. Then there were the family dinners. Those were the worst. We'd all sit around the table, and Robert would drill us about our day. For Sophie, it was all smiles and encouragement. For me, it was like a job interview. He'd ask about my grades, my friends, my plans for the future. And no matter what I said, his response was always the same. You need to do better, Lena. It wasn't just words, his tone, his body language. It all screamed disappointment. I started to dread those dinners. I'd sit there, pushing my food around my plate, waiting for the inevitable critique. Even when I tried to meet his expectations, it felt like I was climbing a never-ending mountain. The few times I did push back, it didn't end well. I remember one night when I was about 13. Robert was going on about how I needed to think about my future, about how important it was to stay focused. I snapped. I told him I was tired of always being criticized, tired of never being good enough. He just looked at me, calm as ever, and said, "Life's not about being good enough, Lena. It's about being better. Better. Always better." I hated that word. It felt like no matter how hard I tried, I'd never be good enough for him. Sophie didn't have to be better. She just had to be Sophie, and that was enough. By the time I hit my late teens, I was done trying to please him. I still worked hard in school, but it wasn't for Robert anymore. It was for me. I realized that no matter what I did, his approval wasn't going to come. And honestly, it was freeing. I stopped looking for his praise and started focusing on what I wanted. But that didn't mean the resentment went away. Every time Sophie got another free pass, every time Robert overlooked my efforts, it chipped away at me. I started to put up walls, not just with Robert, but with everyone. It was easier to not expect anything from anyone than to keep getting let down. Looking back now, I can see how much it shaped who I am. I learned to be independent, to rely on myself, but I also learned how much it hurts to feel second best, to feel like no matter what you do, you're never enough. The day of the funeral came quicker than I expected. It's funny how time messes with you like that. One minute you're planning, sorting through old pictures, and the next you're standing in a room filled with people, all wearing their best funeral faces. You know the look, somber, head slightly tilted like they really get what you're going through, but they don't. How could they? I stood near the entrance of the funeral home, half-heartedly greeting people as they came in. Some faces I recognized from the company, others were old family friends. And then there were the strangers, people who knew Robert in ways I never did. They'd come up to me, offering their condolences, talking about what a great man Robert was. "He always put family first," one guy said, shaking his head like it was some profound truth. I just nodded, biting my tongue. Family first? Sure, if you meant Sophie. Speaking of Sophie, she arrived fashionably late, of course. She walked in like she owned the place, all polished and composed, with her husband in tow. I hadn't seen her in a while, and somehow, she looked even more put together than I remembered. Meanwhile, I felt like a mess, inside and out. The service started, and I took my seat in the front row, right next to my mom. She looked so fragile, clutching a tissue in one hand, her other hand resting on my arm. I could tell she was struggling, but she didn't say much. Just little whispers here and there about how proud Robert would have been of the turnout. Proud. That word felt so foreign when connected to Robert. I couldn't remember a single time he'd said he was proud of me. The eulogy started, and it was like listening to a story about someone I'd never met. They talked about Robert's dedication, his leadership, how he built R&L Enterprises from the ground up. Every word felt like it was meant to paint him as this larger-than-life figure. But to me, he was just complicated. Strict, distant, and yeah, sometimes caring in his own way, but nothing like the man they were describing. Then it was Sophie's turn to speak. She stepped up to the podium, looking every bit the grieving daughter. Her voice wavered just enough to sound genuine, but I knew better. "Robert was more than just a father," she started. "He was my guide, my mentor, my inspiration." I clenched my fists, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from rolling my eyes. Every word felt like a performance, tailored to make her look like the perfect daughter. After the service, people mingled, exchanging stories and catching up like it was some kind of reunion. I stayed near the edge of the room, avoiding the small talk as much as I could. That's when Sophie found me. She pulled me aside, her expression serious but calm, like she was about to deliver some life-changing news. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. I followed her to a quieter corner, half expecting some heartfelt attempt at reconnecting. Maybe she'd acknowledge the distance between us, the years of unspoken tension. But no, that would have been too much to ask. "Lena," she began, folding her arms across her chest, "I think it's time we discuss the company." I frowned, caught off guard. "The company?" "Yes," she said, her tone matter of fact. "Robert would have wanted me to take over. I mean, it's the logical choice." "Logical?" I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "Sophie, what are you talking about? We haven't even read the will yet." She shrugged, as if the details didn't matter. "Come on, Lena. You've always known this was coming. I've been preparing for this my whole life. Robert trusted me with everything." I felt my stomach tighten. All those years I spent working late, making sure the company didn't fall apart while Robert was sick, it all flashed before my eyes. And now Sophie was standing there, acting like it was a given that she'd take the reins. "I don't think it's that simple," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sophie's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, her polished exterior cracked. "Look, Lena, I'm not trying to be harsh, but you know as well as I do that the company needs someone who understands it, someone who can lead." "And you think that's you?" I shot back, my frustration bubbling to the surface. She tilted her head, giving me that condescending smile I'd seen a million times. "It's not about what I think. It's about what Robert wanted." I wanted to scream, to tell her about all the nights I stayed up, working on reports, handling clients, doing everything I could to keep R&L Enterprises afloat. But I didn't. Instead, I just nodded, my mind racing with all the things I couldn't say. "Fine," I muttered. "We'll see what the will says." Sophie looked like she wanted to argue, but instead, she just gave a small, satisfied smile. "I guess we will." As she walked away, I felt this overwhelming mix of anger and defeat. It was like all those years of being second best had led to this moment, and no matter what, Sophie always seemed to come out on top. The rest of the day was a blur. People came up to me, offering more condolences, more stories about the great Robert. I nodded along, barely listening, my mind stuck on the confrontation with Sophie. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. By the time I finally got home, I was exhausted. I sank into the couch, replaying the day in my head. The service, the eulogies, Sophie's words, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite fit together. I knew I had to brace myself for what was coming next, because if there was one thing I was sure of, it was that Sophie wasn't going to back down without a fight. The day of the will reading felt like one of those slow-motion moments in a movie. You know something big is coming, but you can't fast forward, and the suspense is almost unbearable. I walked into Mr. Bennett's office, half expecting some dramatic reveal, and honestly, I was bracing myself for the worst. Sophie was already there, sitting in one of those leather chairs like she owned the place. Her face was calm, but I knew her well enough to catch that little smirk hiding underneath. I nodded at her, keeping my expression neutral, and took a seat. The room felt stuffy, like the air was heavy with everything left unsaid between us. Mr. Bennett sat behind his big oak desk, a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of him. He gave us a polite smile, but his eyes were serious. "Thank you both for coming," he began, shuffling the papers as he spoke. "I know this is a difficult time." Difficult was putting it lightly. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the tension radiating from Sophie. She didn't bother with small talk, cutting straight to the point. "Let's get this over with," she said, leaning back in her chair. "I have plans for the company, and I'd like to start as soon as possible." Plans for the company. The words stung. She was acting like it was already hers, like the decision had been made before we even stepped into that room. I bit my tongue, deciding to let Mr. Bennett do his job. He cleared his throat and started reading the will, his voice steady and professional. At first it was the usual stuff. Funeral arrangements, personal belongings. My mind was only half listening, waiting for the part that really mattered. Sophie, on the other hand, was sitting there with this air of confidence, like she knew exactly what was coming. And then it happened. "I, Robert Davis, being of sound mind and body, hereby leave my entire estate, including all shares and control of R&L Enterprises, to my stepdaughter, Lena Davis." For a second I thought I'd misheard. I blinked, trying to process the words. My heart stopped, and the room went dead silent. Sophie's smirk vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of shock and pure disbelief. "What?" she blurted out, leaning forward in her chair. That can't be right." Mr. Bennett stayed calm, nodding as he continued. "It's all here, in writing. Robert was very clear about his wishes. Sophie's face turned red, her hands clenching into fists. "This is ridiculous!" she snapped. "I'm his daughter! The company should be mine!" I sat there, stunned, my mind racing. I couldn't believe it. After all these years of feeling like I was never good enough, like I was always second place, Robert had left everything to me. It didn't make sense. Why would he do that? Sophie wasn't done. "This has to be a mistake," she said, her voice rising. "Lena couldn't possibly handle the company. She's just a placeholder." The words hit hard, but before I could say anything, Mr. Bennett spoke up. "There's no mistake," he said firmly. "Robert made this decision after careful consideration. He even left a letter explaining his reasoning." He reached for an envelope, handing it to me. My hands shook as I took it, my eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "You can read it later," Mr. Bennett said gently. "But for now, you both need to understand that this is final." Sophie's eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to a dangerous level. "You think you're going to just waltz in and take over? You think you can run the company without me?" I met her gaze, feeling a mix of anger and determination rising in my chest. "I didn't ask for this, Sophie, but if Robert trusted me with it, then I'm going to do my best." Her laugh was bitter. "Your best? That's a joke. You'll ruin everything." I could feel the heat in my cheeks, but I refused to back down. "We'll see about that." Sophie stood abruptly, grabbing her purse. "This isn't over," she hissed before storming out of the room. The door slammed behind her, leaving me alone with Mr. Bennett. The silence was deafening, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I know this is a lot to take in," Mr. Bennett said softly. "But Robert believed in you, Lena. He saw something in you that maybe even you didn't see." I nodded slowly, still clutching the letter. I don't understand why he'd do this." Mr. Bennett gave me a small, understanding smile. "Maybe the letter will help." I thanked him and left the office, the envelope feeling heavy in my hands. Outside, the world felt different. Everything had shifted in the span of a few minutes, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of me was relieved, another part overwhelmed. But mostly, I was just tired of the fighting, the doubt, the constant struggle to prove myself. As I walked to my car, Sophie's words echoed in my head. "This isn't over." And I knew she meant it. This wasn't just about the company for her. It was personal. It always had been. But for once, I wasn't going to let her overshadow me. Robert had trusted me, and whether I understood it or not, I had to honor that. I owed it to myself, to all the years I'd spent trying to be enough. Sitting in the driver's seat, I took one last look at the envelope before tucking it into my bag. Whatever was in that letter could wait. For now, I had to focus on what came next, because, like Sophie said, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. I sat on my couch that night, staring at the envelope with my name on it. It felt heavier than it should, like it was holding all the answers I didn't even know I needed. Robert's handwriting was neat, precise, just like everything else about him. For a long while, I just held it, wondering what he could possibly have to say that he couldn't tell me when he was alive. The room was quiet, but my mind was racing. I'd gone through so many emotions since the will reading. Shock, anger, confusion, and now I was just numb. Sophie's reaction still echoed in my head, her disbelief, her accusations. But what got to me the most was the fact that Robert had chosen me. After all those years of feeling like I was never enough, this felt surreal. Finally, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I slid my finger under the flap and opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The edges were crisp, but the words inside? They felt like they'd been waiting a lifetime to be read. "Dear Lena, I know that by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Writing this letter wasn't easy, but I felt like it was something I needed to do. There are things I should have said to you a long time ago, but I didn't know how. I've made a lot of mistakes, Lena, more than I can count. One of the biggest was how I treated you. I know I wasn't the father you deserved. I was too hard on you, too focused on making you better, and I see now how much that hurt you. I want you to know it was never because I didn't care. Quite the opposite. From the day I married your mother, I promised myself I would raise you to be strong, independent, someone who could face the world without fear. But in doing that, I lost sight of something important. You needed love, not just lessons. I saw how hard you worked, how much you tried to earn my approval, and it breaks my heart to think I never gave you the recognition you deserved. You've always been capable, more than capable, and I admired that about you. But I never told you, and for that, I'm sorry. Leaving the company to you wasn't a decision I made lightly. I thought long and hard about it, and in the end, it came down to this. You've proven time and time again that you're dedicated, resilient, and responsible. I trust you, Lena, more than anyone else, to carry on the legacy I built. Not because you're my stepdaughter, but because you've earned it. I know Sophie might not understand this choice, and for that I'm sorry too. I failed her in different ways, ways I may never fully understand. But this isn't about her. It's about you, and what you've become despite everything. I hope this letter brings you some clarity, maybe even some peace. You deserved more from me than you got, and I can't change that now. But I want you to know, I saw you, Lena. I always did. Take care of the company. Take care of yourself. And know that I am proud of you. With all my heart, Robert. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. Tears blurred the words on the page, and I had to blink them away. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Robert, stoic, rigid Robert, had written those words. Words I had spent my whole life waiting to hear. Proud. He said he was proud of me. I let out a shaky breath, leaning back against the couch. The letter felt like a lifeline, pulling me out of the storm of doubt and confusion I'd been trapped in. All those years of feeling like I wasn't enough, like no matter what I did, it would never be good enough for him. They didn't seem to matter anymore. I thought about the nights I spent at the office, the times I stayed up late to make sure everything was perfect, hoping he'd notice. And he had. Maybe not in the way I wanted back then, but he had noticed. For the first time, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief because I finally knew how he felt, and sadness because it took him dying for me to hear it. There was so much I wanted to say to him, so many questions I wanted to ask, but now it was too late. I folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was more than I ever thought I'd get from him. As I sat there, the weight of everything started to settle. The company, Sophie, the legacy Robert left behind, it all felt daunting. But for the first time, I felt like I could handle it. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because Robert believed in me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let his trust in me go to waste. This wasn't just about proving something to him anymore. It was about proving it to myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready. The morning after reading Robert's letter, I felt different. Lighter, maybe? Like a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying had been lifted. But that sense of calm didn't last long. Sophie wasn't going to let this go without a fight. And honestly, I wasn't expecting her to. The first call came just after breakfast. I stared at my phone, Sophie's name flashing on the screen, debating whether I should answer. I knew exactly what she was going to say, but part of me wanted to hear it straight from her. Bracing myself, I picked up. "Well, I hope you're happy," Sophie spat before I could even say hello. I sighed. "Good morning to you too, Sophie." "Cut the crap, Lena," she snapped. "You know this isn't right. That company should be mine. Dad would have wanted me to run it." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sophie, I didn't ask for this. I was just as surprised as you were." "Surprised?" She laughed bitterly. "You must be thrilled. You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you? Always trying to one-up me." That hit a nerve. "Are you serious? I've spent my entire life feeling like I wasn't good enough, and now that I finally get some recognition, you're acting like I stole something from you." She went quiet for a moment, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd back down. But then she came back with, "This isn't over. I'm going to fight this. You're not capable of running R&L." And with that, she hung up. I sat there for a while, staring at the phone in my hand. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw something, to lash out, but another part just felt tired. This wasn't about the company, not really. It was about everything that had built up between us over the years. And now it was all spilling out in the worst way. The next few days were tense. Sophie didn't call again, but I knew she wasn't done. The silence was almost worse than the yelling. I kept expecting her to show up at my door or ambush me at the office. Instead, she went radio silent, which was completely unlike her. Sophie was never one to stay quiet when things didn't go her way. And then it happened. I was sitting in the office going over some paperwork when one of the board members knocked on my door. Let's call him Mr. Daniels. He was one of those old-school types, someone who had been with R&L since the beginning. "Lena," he said, stepping inside, "we need to talk." I nodded, motioning for him to sit. "What's going on?" He cleared his throat, looking a little uncomfortable. "I've been hearing things, rumors about Sophie. She's been talking to some of the other board members, questioning your ability to lead." Of course she was. "And?" I asked, keeping my face neutral. "Well, it's causing a bit of unease. Some of the members are starting to wonder if maybe she has a point. I felt my stomach drop. Do you think she's right? Daniels hesitated, which was answer enough. It's not about right or wrong, Lena. It's about perception. Sophie's been with the company too, and she's making a lot of noise. People are listening. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the familiar weight of doubt creeping in. What do you think I should do? He sighed. You need to show them you're in control, that you can handle this. Otherwise, Sophie might get more support than you'd like. Great. Just what I needed. A coup led by my own stepsister. After Daniels left, I sat there staring at the piles of paperwork on my desk. Sophie wasn't just going to challenge me personally, she was going to attack me professionally too. And the worst part? She had the connections and charisma to pull it off. The next day, I called a meeting with the board. If Sophie wanted a fight, I wasn't going to back down. I walked into that room determined to prove I belonged there. It wasn't easy. The tension was thick, and I could see some of the board members exchanging uneasy glances. But I laid out my plans for the company, addressing every concern I could think of. I had to show them that I was ready, that I wasn't just Robert's choice out of sentimentality. By the end of the meeting, I felt like I'd at least made a dent in the doubt swirling around. But the real challenge was still Sophie. Sure enough, a few hours later, she showed up at my office. She didn't bother knocking, just pushed the door open and walked right in. So, you called a meeting without me, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. It was a board meeting, I replied coolly. Last I checked, you're not on the board. She scoffed, crossing her arms. That's just a technicality. I stood facing her. Sophie, what do you want? Because if you're here to argue, I'm not in the mood. What I want, she said, stepping closer, is what's rightfully mine. But since you're so dead set on playing boss, I guess we'll have to do this the hard way. I shook my head, exasperated. This isn't about what's rightfully yours. It's about what Robert thought was best for the company. And whether you like it or not, he trusted me with that responsibility. Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might actually hit me. But then she just smiled, that cold, calculated smile I'd come to know so well. We'll see about that, Lena. We'll see. And with that, she turned and walked out, leaving me standing there, fists clenched at my sides. The fallout wasn't just about the company, it was personal. It was years of resentment and rivalry boiling over, and I knew deep down that this fight was far from over. It's been a few weeks since everything went down, and I'm finally starting to feel like I can breathe again. I won't lie, things have been tense. Sophie's been quiet, which is almost worse than her usual loud, dramatic antics. It's like waiting for a storm you know is coming but can't see on the horizon yet. But despite that, I've been pushing forward, trying to focus on what's ahead. The company is a beast, no doubt about it. Every day feels like I'm juggling 100 different things, and there's always something new popping up that needs my attention. Honestly, I didn't realize how much Robert kept from me when I was just helping out. Now that I'm in charge, it's like I'm seeing the whole picture for the first time. And let me tell you, it's overwhelming. But at the same time, it's also kind of empowering. For so long, I felt like I was in the shadows, like no matter how hard I worked, I'd never get the recognition I deserved. Now, though, it's my name on those documents. My decisions that shape the future of R&L Enterprises. It's a lot of pressure, sure, but it also feels like I'm finally stepping into my own. Of course, not everyone is thrilled about the change. I've had a few moments where I caught certain board members exchanging looks, like they're still questioning whether I can handle this. But after that first big meeting, things started to shift, even if just a little. I made it clear that I'm not here to play games. This company is important to me, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure it thrives. One thing that's really helped is the letter from Robert. I've read it a few times since that first night, and each time it hits me in a different way. Knowing that he saw something in me, that he believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself, it's powerful. It's like a reminder that I'm not just doing this for the company or the legacy, but for myself. I owe it to that little girl who always felt overlooked to make this work. But it's not just about proving myself to the board or living up to Robert's expectations. I've been thinking a lot about what kind of leader I want to be. Robert was all about discipline and structure, which worked in some ways, but also created a lot of tension. I don't want to run R&L like that. I want to create a place where people feel valued, where their ideas matter. That's why I've started making some changes. Nothing huge, yet, but enough to show that things are different now. For one, I've been having more one-on-one meetings with the staff, getting to know them better, and understanding their concerns. It's amazing how much you can learn just by listening. People want to feel heard, and I get that now more than ever. Another big step has been starting a new initiative. I took some of the funds Robert left me and set up a scholarship in his name. It's for kids who come from tough backgrounds, who might not have the opportunities that others do. Education was always important to Robert, and this feels like a good way to honor that while also giving back to the community. The response has been incredible. I've already gotten messages from people thanking me, saying how much this will help their families. It's moments like that when I realize I'm doing something meaningful, not just for the company, but for people's lives. And that feels damn good. But even with all the progress, there's still that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Sophie. I know she's not done. She's too stubborn, too used to getting her way to just let this go. And honestly, I'm not sure what her next move will be. Maybe she's plotting something behind the scenes, or maybe she's just waiting for the right moment to strike. Either way, I'm ready for whatever comes next. In the meantime, I'm focusing on the positives. The company is stable, the staff seems to be warming up to me, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm in control of my own destiny. It's a weird feeling, especially after spending so much of my life trying to meet other people's expectations. Now it's about what I want, what I think is right, and what I want is to build something lasting. Something that not only honors Robert's legacy, but also creates a future I can be proud of. It won't be easy, I know that, but nothing worth having ever is. As I sit here in my office looking out over the city, I can't help but feel a little hopeful. Sure, there are still challenges ahead, and Sophie's shadow looms large, but for the first time, I'm not scared. I'm ready to face whatever comes my way. Because this is my chapter now. My chance to write a different story, not just for the company, but for myself. And I'm not going to waste it.